New Delhi. Jaishankar said during an event in New Delhi on Sunday that negotiations with US were ongoing and the aim was to reach a trade understanding that protects India's national interests. Jaishankar reiterated that a trade understanding with the US was essential. However, any agreement must safeguard India's core interests.
Whatever happens, at the end of the day, there has got to be a trade understanding with the United States. There has to be one because it is the world's largest market, but also because it is, much of the world has reached those understandings. But it has to be an understanding where our bottom lines, our red lines are respected. In any agreement, there are things you can negotiate and there are things you can't.
Jaishankar had drawn India's red line in the context of recent tensions over the tariffs imposed by US. Now let's look at the origin of the term red line, derived from the concept of a line in the sand. The term red lines appears to have emerged in the 70s to denote actions one nation regards as unacceptable from other nations. In a nutshell, it is an implicit threat. In 2021, President Putin said Russia would be forced to act if its red lines on Ukraine were crossed by NATO. Former US President James Monroe's Monroe Doctrine in 1823 involved drawing a red line with an implicit war threat by the US against any European effort to colonize or reassert control in the Western Hemisphere. In a meeting with the US President Joseph Biden in November 2022, Chinese President Xi Jinping declared that Taiwan was the first red line that must not be crossed. Donald Trump has been keeping everybody guessing as usual, from calling India and China funders of Russia's Ukraine at the UN to terming Prime Minister Modi a good friend, while also cozying up to Pakistan and repeatedly making a claim on the ceasefire that followed Operation Sindoor. But finally, we have also drawn that red line. But most important thing is that the Prime Minister has said that he will not allow the interest of the farmers to be sacrificed. Let me straight away go to Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta. Sir, to put it simply for our viewers, you are the expert. What is the red line that Jaishankar is talking about tangibly? What is that red line?
I think Minister Jaishankar is talking about several red lines, not a single one. And the first one, of course, would be agriculture and dairy, and allowing GMO foods to come in. And of course, soya and corn, which is mostly GM in the US. So that is one. The other one is, of course, dairy. And dairy products is another red line. Apart from these, which may have triggered the first set of 25% tariffs on India with effect from the 7th of August, Minister Jaishankar has also mentioned the second tranche, which is related to the Russian purchase of Russian oil. And that is another red line, that we will continue to buy Russian oil. And we will exercise our strategic autonomy to buy from whichever source we want to. So these are palpably the most important red lines. There could be a few others where there could be some amount of give. But I think on these three issues, there is absolutely no compromising. That is what Minister Jaishankar seems to be implying very clearly.
Ambassador, Jaishankar also said one more important thing. He said that both countries have not landed on a common ground where, they could align themselves on certain issues in which they agree, which means that the conversation that is taking place has not been able to create that foundation.
Yes. I think another very important aspect of these negotiations is that President Trump has been harping on the trade deficit in only goods terms. And if you take services, if you take IPR, royalties, and the whole gamut of flows of funds or money, then the situation is not as adverse as President Trump points out. So I think that has led to the levying of this tariff, these tariffs of 25%.
But Ambassador,
there has to be some kind of an understanding which has to be arrived at, that, what is it that you are taking into account to come to your conclusions, and how do you want us to cooperate so as to address this situation.
But,
of course, India seems to.
But
Yes.
the reason why I wanted to come back on this issue is, he says that we have not arrived at a landing ground for a trade discussion. And he said that the talks with the US for the trade understanding, where our bottom lines and red lines are respected. When he says that landing ground for a trade discussions, we have not arrived there, what does it mean, sir? A lot of people would say, iska matlab kya hai?
I think the basic thing is the rationale for imposing tariffs on India, which don't seem to have any logic. Of course, the tariffs on the other countries also don't seem to have any logic. So that is, I think, what he's been hinting at, to my mind, that the whole logic of imposing, unilateral tariffs and very high tariffs at that, based on some calculation initially of the trade deficit, which has also now been, I think, thrown overboard. It is no longer about trade deficits. It is just that I will do it. And since we are the largest market in the world and you are so heavily dependent, you have a trade surplus, you will bow to our wishes and accept these tariffs.
Or is it because of the fact that Americans never expected this? The sort of a line which Jaishankar has used. These are the things you can negotiate. There are things you can negotiate and there are things you cannot negotiate. And we are pretty clear about that. And that has been the conversation really which has been going on since March. I think the Americans never expected such a tough line from the Indians.
I think the Americans, the present administration, miscalculated India's stand. And they thought that they could get away by pushing and pushing. And that is what I think their seasoned diplomats and people who have been studying the Indo-US relations for decades have told the Trump administration people that India can't be pushed around. And of course, President Putin has mentioned it very recently, that, you can't get away by doing this to India. And of course, he's also mentioned China. But India, even though it is not in the same league as China in terms of the size of the economy, in terms of its export potential and military capabilities at the moment, India has its own position and standing in the world, and it can't be pushed around. It is a proud nation with more than 5,000 years of civilizational history. So that is what I think has to go across, of course. But the basic thing is, what is the rationale of the Trump administration throwing the whole international trading system, which has been arrived at after 70 odd years of careful negotiations since the 1940s, late 1948 onwards, just throwing it overboard and then imposing tariffs on a whim. And that too, differential tariffs.
The former foreign secretary also wrote today in a newspaper that, Trump has no India policy. He's just pursuing his interest, and it should be a wake-up call.
Yes, I think there are analyses which show that that President Trump had expected India to keel over much earlier, and also be counted. He could have wanted to count it as a victory. But not having got that, and of course India not endorsing his candidature for the Nobel Peace Prize, and also not acknowledging that he had any role to play in the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. I think all these things put together have led him to try to put additional pressure on India, and that is why I think he has gone out of his way to court the so-called Field Marshal of Pakistan and the Pakistani administration. And he is, of course, also trying to ensure that his, family's business interests are taken care of. So all these things have conflated, I think, to come to this kind of a pass where the US, President Trump has forgotten what he said a few years ago during his first stint about Pakistan, about its harboring terrorists and doing various kinds of illicit activities. But he's just turned over a new leaf, and he seems to have forgotten everything that he said, and for good reason. So it is, I think, in part an attempt to teach India a lesson and to break this developing relationship between India and China, and of course the very existing strong relationship between India and Russia.
I personally feel, Ambassador, that this line, I don't think the Trump administration would have expected. There are certain things you can negotiate and there are certain things you cannot negotiate. And then the foreign minister puts it publicly, and that's the best part of the entire, his speech, which I like, You confront a bully up front, And I think that's what has happened. You tell him that this can't happen, and that's what he has done. Thank you, sir, for decoding Foreign Minister Jaishankar's speech. And this is all I had in On Point today. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time. Thank you and good night.
भाई ऑन रोड या ऑफ रोड?
रोड ट्रिप पे किस बाइक की सवारी होगी, ये खूबसूरत चिंता आप करिए। 2-व्हीलर लोन की चिंता हम संभाल लेंगे विद स्पॉट अप्रूवल एंड लोन अप टू 95%।
This is my temple, this is my mental peace sanctuary.
The ultimate biking experience is incomplete without Servo 40 Extra from Indian Oil. Servo 40 Extra from Indian Oil. Can't do without it.
नई गाड़ी लेनी पड़ेगी
हमें भी।
शोरूम खोला जल्दी।
हम तक महंगा इंश्योरेंस बेचने की पूरी कोशिश हो सकती है, जबरदस्ती।
कौन करेगा जबरदस्ती? खोड़ दूंगा इधर मैं।
कम लाकर नई गाड़ी के लिए हम एको कार इंश्योरेंस ही लेंगे।
फेयर प्राइस, कम प्रीमियम।
बात खत्म।
बात खत्म।
बात खत्म।
कार का एक्शन हीरो एको।